Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. We're continuing to discuss different aspects of Israel's unprovoked war on Iran, which torpedoed the U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations and are leading the region and the world closer to a catastrophic war. For this, we will soon be joined by Dr. Arman Grigoryan, who is an associate professor of international relations at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania.
Folks, before we begin, our regular request, and I don't think I'm boasting, but I would like to say that Groong is the only English language podcast with regularly updated Armenian-centric content that is fully independent, not funded by any foreign governments or interest groups. And we take particular pride in that. And both Asbed and I donate a large part of our time to ensure Groong's survival. So we know also that if you're watching this, then you value our work. If so, then please head to podcast.groong.org/donate, where you can find the links to become a sustaining member, much preferred. But if you can't, then even just a one-time donation would be very welcome.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't contribute financially, you can still like, comment, share our episodes with friends and anyone you think would be interested in them. You can do that in addition to supporting, of course, financially as well. So thank you for listening, folks. And without further ado, on to the show.
Dr. Grigoryan, welcome back to the Groong podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, Dr. Grigoryan.
Hello, Hovik.
Well, it's the 8th day of Israel's unprovoked war against Iran. And on this day, Trump chose to join the war by attacking several nuclear sites in Iran using a powerful arsenal of U.S. weaponry. This is while the genocide in Gaza is continuing, and everyone is now sort of bracing for what would happen next. But I just wanted to start with your impressions of the attack by the United States. There's a lot of speculation when Trump said that this was meant as a so-called one-off attack, and that if Iran does not retaliate, then the U.S. will not retaliate. But given all of the history of the Trump administration during these negotiations, many people find that hard to believe, including yours truly. So I wanted to get your impressions of this attack and dire escalation in the current war between Israel and Iran and the U.S.
I think what has happened is the following. They initially, I think, hoped that Israel's surprise attack would achieve the maximum result, that it would produce the collapse of the regime and complete disarray and disorder in Iran, and they would be able to shape the situation in Iran and help some new government to form and dictate the terms. I mean, we have seen these latest PR blitz with the son of the Shah, and there is some obvious project there about replacing the current regime in Iran. And I think if you look at the nature of the Israeli attack, the primary aim was to paralyze the regime and to produce its disintegration, its collapse. I think they also hoped that even if that didn't happen, they would paralyze Iran's capacity to fight back. I think both of these aims failed quite obviously, quite strikingly, one might add. The Iranian system recovered quite quickly from this decapitation attack, and they had the ability to retaliate and to strike back. It also seems, from if you look at some information and some internal Israeli debates and bickering, it seems that Israelis also had underestimated Iran's capability to strike Israel successfully and to overcome Israel's missile defense shield. So a week into this campaign, it became obvious that the initial aim of the Israeli attack had failed. And people had already started talking about the catastrophe, the looming catastrophe that Israel was facing. Their munitions were running out, particularly the air defense systems were running low on missiles. and Iranians were able to strike very important targets. So there wasn't an obvious response that Israel had. There wasn't an obvious path to escalation that could turn the tide. And I think this is when it was decided that the United States should get into the fray. And the hope is, I think the hope is that the United States attack would change the balance, would change the situation. Even if it is a one-off attack, Iranians might think twice before they retaliate, and they might become amenable to negotiations. The problem is that I don't know what negotiations could produce. If you look at the Israeli demands, at the Israeli aims, I mean, they have been articulated quite clearly. Namely, Israel wants the complete elimination of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, including the civilian. I mean, not including, they only have a civilian nuclear infrastructure, and the destruction of that infrastructure has been the clearly articulated goal of and demand for Israel. And also, it seems like Israel wants a regime change in Iran. So both are non-starters. I don't think these are things that the current Iranian government would be willing to entertain as an agenda for negotiations. So I don't actually know what this has achieved. Now, the interesting question is what Iran will do to respond to this. And I think one of the reasons why the Trump administration has said it's a one-off attack is to give Iran an opportunity not to retaliate on the basis of the argument that if you retaliate now, there will be counter retaliation, and we don't want that escalation. I think that has been the reason for the Trump administration's statement.
Yeah, because
But
Iran has said that it will retaliate against U.S. forces in the
yeah,
region.
yeah, they have made that statement. Of course, sometimes governments make statements that they don't live up to.
Mhm.
It remains to be seen if in any process of escalation, Iran can possibly have dominance, right? That's not obvious that the escalation with the United States is in Iran's interest. Most likely, I think, is Iran will continue pounding Israel. And if there are follow-up attacks by the United States, I think it will put Iran in a very difficult situation, and gradually it will become more and more difficult not to retaliate against American targets. Now, one way for Iranians to think about retaliation and possible escalation scenarios is to create a situation where the United States comes to the conclusion that simply aerial bombardment, aerial attacks, these punishment attacks are not going to be effective. And the only way for the United States to deal with the Iranian resistance is a ground offensive, which every expert and their best friends would tell you that the United States would love to avoid, especially the U.S. military would like to avoid. Every military analyst will tell you that this is not Iraq, that it's a much bigger country, the terrain is different, they are much more sophisticated. The Iranian army is much more sophisticated, so it's going to be a hell of a task, hell of a challenge for the U.S. To launch a ground invasion and to complete and to have a successful outcome with their ground forces. So the one caveat here, of course, is the likely use of low-yield nuclear devices. So that I think is a terrible possibility,
Yeah.
and I think that will completely reorder international politics. I think that will take us into a completely and utterly different world. But at this point, I think if their backs are on the wall, if Israel's back is on the wall, if America is choosing between using such munitions and attacking using launching a ground invasion. I think that that alas may become a possibility. So that is
Yeah.
my biggest fear.
Yeah, we'll talk more about some of these aspects later, but you mentioned several different goals that Israel has. I
Mhm.
wonder if which one is the highest priority? Is it like this mowing the lawn strategy that they use, which I hate that word, but it's been in use, like trying to degrade Iran's capabilities to produce nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles for decades. And then you also mentioned regime change. Obviously, if you get like a controlled regime change, then maybe that would knock off both of those birds with one stone.
Mhm.
But there are also some analysts who say that the goal of Israel and with apparently U.S. support is complete domination of Israel, the Israeli state in the Middle East, which would presume that just destroying some of the capacity for 10 years would not be sufficient. So, we've seen several different, suggestions that Israel could be that Iran could be partitioned, different ways of how Iran could be dismembered. You may not be a military analyst, but I think you have a very good strategic capacity. So, what is the true U.S. and Israeli goal, and what would be victory for Israel and the U.S., and what is the goal for Iran, and what would be victory for Iran in this war? It would be a qualified victory, but for instance, if Iran manages to survive as a regime but with degraded capabilities, would that be, how would that be viewed? And since this is given the way that it's escalating, this seems to be like a framed as a zero-sum game. So, does this mean that it would be either like an Iranian victory or a U.S. plus Israeli victory? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so there were several questions there.
Right.
First, the arguments of these two camps. I'm firmly in the camp of analysts who argue that the primary aim for this campaign was not the Iranian nuclear program. And the reason I think that is because there were other ways of credibly controlling the Iranian civilian nuclear program. And many analysts agree that the JCPOA that was signed under Obama was a very, very successful outcome, and it allowed pretty much full control over Iran's nuclear program, or full monitoring of Iran's nuclear program, and people could be pretty certain that it would not evolve into a weapons program. Um, and by the way, this is not just the opinion of experts outside of Israel, or experts with access to grind. This was also the opinion of the Israeli Atomic Energy Agency. At the time, they celebrated that agreement. They thought that agreement was the optimal agreement, and Netanyahu and his supporters disagreed. So again, if the aim is to establish control over Iran's nuclear program, or at least if the aim is to make sure that Iran's nuclear program does not evolve into a military program, that could be done in other ways. It could be done through an agreement like the JCPOA, and the Iranians were amenable to such negotiations, and that's pretty much what they were negotiating with the United States. And some people argue that, putting aside the fact that Trump was not engaged in these negotiations seriously, but there was support for these negotiations in the United States. There was support for such an outcome in the United States. And one could hypothesize that one of the reasons why Israel launched the attack was to torpedo these negotiations. But again, my view is that the nuclear program of Iran was not the main reason. And again, a few weeks before the attack, the U.S. intelligence had issued yet another report arguing that Iranians are not engaged in a weaponization program. So all the arguments about Iran being weeks away from having a weapon, I don't think are not credible. So I'm firmly in the camp of analysts who think that this is about Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. It's about making sure that Israel can do whatever it wants without any impediment, without any country in the region that can impose costs on Israel for its policy toward Palestinians and toward the path of creating greater Israel. And I don't think it's an attribution anymore. It's kind of an inference from what Israelis are doing that they are engaged in such a project. It's pretty out in the open that that's what Israel is pursuing. And especially with the policy in Gaza over the last 2 years and the prevalent mood in Israel, in the Israeli public opinion, and the utter radicalization of the Israeli public opinion and Israeli politics, we can see that there is no return path from here, and they are really engaged in some massive project, and this has been the case for quite some time, for a couple of decades, in fact. I mean, well, let's remember what the clean break article was in, I believe it was in 1996. We have to give up on the idea of finding some kind of an agreement with Palestinians. The Oslo process had been a failure, and we have to have a clean break and embrace a completely different approach. Of course, they didn't quite spell out the details of it, right? And one is justified to ask the proponents of such a policy, if you don't want a Palestinian state, if you don't want a common democratic state, a democratic state with equal citizenship for Palestinians, what exactly is the third option, right? What are you planning on doing? And if you're creating this greater Israel, what is going to be the fate of the Palestinian population? These details are not spelled out, but it's pretty clear that at the very least, the compromise solutions are taken off the table for the current Israeli elite. And if they are going to pursue that policy, they are going to need to remove all the impediments. So they have already removed Iraq, which was a serious impediment. And I know people might say, well, it was the U.S. that went to Iraq, and I think by now we can be pretty sure that this was one of the most important motives for the second Iraq war, especially given the fact that all the possible other justifications are in retrospect seem ridiculous, and we know that justifications made absolutely no sense. And there is some literature already arguing, Mearsheimer's and Walt's book being the most important one, arguing that this was an important motive for the second Iraq war. So Iraq is gone, Syria is gone as a serious impediment, and some of the proxies of Iran, Hezbollah has been, for the time being, seriously weakened. Houthis remain the only serious point of resistance, the only other serious actor that is resisting Israel, plus Iran. And if you take out Iran, of course, Houthis are not going to be terribly consequential either. So I think this is a coordinated, well thought out long-term plan, and that's what Israel has been after. And I think the Iranian nuclear program has been a side issue. I think the most important issue has been to remove Iran as an impediment one way or the other, just like the other Middle Eastern states hostile to Israel have been essentially subdued.
Yeah, you mentioned Iraq too. In fact, I've been having flashbacks to 2003 with the whole giant weapons of mass destruction lies that were fed to the American people to initiate that attack. And this just feels exactly the same thing all over.
If Iran is able to survive
Mhm.
as a state, without regime change, in your view, would that be a victory for Iran?
Oh yeah, I forgot to answer those other questions. First of all, I think it would be a victory for Iran. So Israel's and America's task is much more complicated in terms of what they can call victory, right? If Iran survives, it will be a victory for Iran, and it will be an absolute catastrophe for Israel, or at least for the Netanyahu government and for this policy. The failure of that policy will become too obvious for anybody not to see. Now, if the Iranian regime survives, and in fact, according to some analysts, even if a new regime comes to power in Iran, let's say a secular nationalist regime, which is probably the most likely type of regime that would replace the Islamic Republic, I think we can now be pretty sure that the Iranian nuclear program would accelerate and would be weaponized. I think at this point for Iran, if they are to survive this, not to develop nuclear weapons would be downright irrational. And they do have the capacity, and they do have the technical and other means for going down that path full throttle. And if they survive, I think this the most likely outcome is a nuclear Iran. I don't see how they would not do it.
Hmm.
And we do have parallel historical parallels to this. I mean,
With Iraq.
with Iraq, right? In 1981, they destroyed the Osirak reactor, and it was hailed as a major success. And the Iraqi nuclear program became a much more serious one, and it accelerated. And the investments in that program were increased quite dramatically, and it came pretty close to having a nuclear weapon before Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And there are all sorts of stories about that, and about how Saddam Hussein was sort of lured to invade Kuwait, and the first Gulf War was a preventive war to take care of the Iraqi nuclear program at the time. So, but I don't want to get into the details of that conversation or that debate. But the point relevant to our conversation is that the destruction of the Osirak reactor and that preventive attack on the Iraqi nuclear program only led to the acceleration of the Iraqi nuclear program. And I don't see any reason to think that Iran would behave differently, and the incentives for Iran now to go nuclear are much more obvious and much more powerful. And the only caveat here is whether the Iranian regime will survive, whether Iran will survive this war, and that cannot be guaranteed. It's a war that it's difficult to predict the ultimate outcome of this war. Again, so that's conditional on Iran surviving this war. If they do, I think Iran becoming a nuclear power is pretty much a foregone conclusion for me.
Right.
Arman, let's explore a little bit the various sides that are backing the two sides of this war, the Iran and Israel. We obviously talked about the U.S. Russia and China have very extensive economic ties with Iran. And as a matter of fact, as of January, there's a comprehensive strategic partnership between Iran and Russia, but it doesn't include any kind of defense. It includes a lot of technical cooperation, but it's not a defense thing. In fact, Putin had offered apparently to have a joint air defense capability between the two countries, but Iran said no to that because they wanted to make sure that they can still have some angle of rapprochement with the West. But of course, that didn't happen. Meanwhile, we've heard reports of plane loads of weaponry coming from China to Iran, and today there was a conversation between the foreign ministers of Iran and China also presented a four-point de-escalation plan at the United Nations. What support can Iran expect from its partners, Russia and also China? Because when we were talking about a week ago with Fyodor Lukyanov, who is a Russian expert on these matters, our impression was that Russia is solely focused on Ukraine. That is priority one, and everything else kind of disappears. So what can we expect for Iran? What kind of help can they expect?
That is my impression as well. I think recent statements by Putin also confirm that impression, lend support to that impression. It's true that Putin made that statement about Iran itself rejecting the offer to create a joint air defense system. But it seemed like Putin was using that more as an excuse than as an explanation for the relatively inert posture that Russia has since the war escalated in Iran a week ago.
Mhm.
What is it now? 10 days ago. So,
It started on June 13.
yeah,
So this is
so
day 8.
day eight, yeah. So the Russian posture is easy to explain. I think there is not much that is mysterious about the Russian posture, even though Russia is doing relatively well now on the Ukrainian front. They're advancing, and militarily their situation is better. It is not true that it is easy and that Russians can split their resources and pay attention to multiple fronts and get involved in multiple hot spots. So I think Russia has to concentrate its resources, its attention on Ukraine. I mean, one could even contemplate a situation where they have reached an understanding where the United States, well, I don't want to make that attribution, but I think the Russians might also not want to give the United States additional incentives,
Mhm.
the United States or Israel and their supporters additional incentives to increase their support for Ukraine by getting involved in Iran. And if you look at the relative resources, I mean, Russians might have to worry about that, and it's a very costly and difficult campaign in Ukraine, and I plainly think that the Russians cannot afford to get involved in Iran now. So that I think is my explanation.
What about
As far as
China?
China, as far as China is concerned, now the Chinese probably don't want to get too involved, too directly involved. First of all, I think the capacity for China to help Iran, it's not obvious to me that they can really be effective and they can lend Iran the kind of support that would ensure Iran's survival. Their power projection capabilities are quite limited. So we're talking essentially about supplying Iran with certain resources and with certain armaments. But again, I think the Chinese also, even though the relationship between China and the United States has deteriorated in the last couple of years, well, especially after Trump coming to power, the tensions have increased. The Chinese uh, have a policy, and this is a long-term policy. This is not just a policy that was adopted recently. As long as China is growing and growing faster than the United States, and modernizing its army, modernizing its economy, and as long as you look at the relative growth of the United States and China, and as long as that process is in China's favor, China does not have incentives to pick a fight with the United States now, and to provoke some kind of a preventive war against China and some kind of a showdown over Taiwan. This is the reason why the Chinese have been behaving with moderation and trying to avoid conflicts wherever possible and to resolve conflicts wherever possible with the United States. So I think that policy is still in place and that policy still motivates China's behavior. That understanding still motivates China's behavior. Of course, this has to be balanced with the concern that the United States may and Israel may score such an important victory, and that would increase the US power and influence in the region. And just plainly from the perspective of the balance of power, they might want to make sure that Iran withstands this pressure and that Iran is not easily overwhelmed. But again, they have to balance these two concerns. On the one hand, they might want to help Iran. Again, the caveat being that it's not clear how much and in what way they can help Iran. And on the other hand, they do want to avoid a major confrontation with the United States.
So, on the other side, last week the G7 countries held a summit in Canada. The leaders of the US, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Canada, as the host, invited some other Western-friendly countries to observe. Notably, I think India was there, and then Mexico, South Africa, etc. Then they made a very one-sided pro-Israeli pronouncement. They were all lined up behind Israel as the country that has the right to defend itself, etc., etc. What's going on with Europe and what's going on with the EU? Are they really a relevant entity at this point, especially in this fight? Do they have the means to affect the outcome of this war? Can they be mediators? I mean, I find it strange that there are some reports, even right now, that in the middle of this war, Iran has a channel open with I'll call it the JCPOA countries.
And we should mention that shortly before the U.S. attack, the night before, there were negotiations in Europe. And basically what the Europeans did is present the same ultimatum that, go and negotiate with the U.S. even if Israel is attacking you right now. Meanwhile, Arakchi was saying, we will only negotiate with Israel and the U.S. after you stop attacking us.
I think Europe... I'm trying to be as gentle in my language as possible, speaking about.
Don't be.
I mean, first of all, the kind of authority and the kind of reputation that Europe had may be undeserved, maybe not fully deserved, but still it had the reputation of a continent or an organization. If we're talking about the EU, and not just the EU, it's multiple, pan-European organizations, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, etc., as a region where they have overcome the traditional balance of power logic, and they are completely devoted to a sort of international system and international behavior that derives its legitimacy from common norms and international law and human rights and that sort of thing. And over the last 2 years, especially after October 7th and the European attitude toward that conflict, it's impossible to argue that there is any consistency or any seriousness about Europe's dedication to these principles and to these values and to these norms. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the European elites, and this is not just true about the European elites, it's true also of the Israeli and the American elites, they have lost their capacity to think strategically. it's it's reactive. It's sometimes, they have a conflict, and they don't approach conflicts in a way like, okay, let's war game these. What are the outcomes? What are the possible scenarios? What happens if we escalate this conflict? What is the end game? What is the exit strategy? None of these questions are asked. I mean, they plunge headlong into this conflict, and I think this is into these conflicts, and I think this is the consequence of 30 years of such behavior with impunity. This is the consequence of European or not European, Western domination of the international system for the last 30 years. And they've gotten used to a certain way of behaving, a certain way of acting. And I don't think it's relevant now at this point. I don't think that posture is justified anymore. And the world has changed quite significantly and quite appreciably, but they keep behaving that way. And there's also the obvious degradation of the quality of European elites, European policymaking elites. I mean, sometimes I look at people like Kaya Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen and the Germany's foreign minister, former in the former government, in the previous government.
Annalena Baerbock.
I mean, these are recent and when was it that Liz Truss became the prime minister of Great Britain? I mean, people like this would never have a chance in European politics even a couple decades ago. I mean, this is quite serious. I mean, these people do not seem like they have the most basic understanding of international relations. So, uh, whether Europe is going to be relevant, I think they are simply going through the motions. They are simply making statements and behaving on the basis of certain inertia, certain commitments, and there is not much more that I can say about Europe. And also, up until recently, up until the advent of the coming to power of the Trump administration, I mean, speaking of Europe's independent foreign policy behavior, I mean, took quite a bit of imagination. Essentially, Europe was an extension of American power and American preferences. Now you do see some rifts and some disputes and some conflicts, but let's not forget, even though we have the Trump administration, which is quite, at least in terms of its rhetoric, quite different, and it has picked some fights with the Europeans, and on certain issues they have had different attitudes, most notably about Ukraine. But I mean, the traditional neoliberal, neoconservative, interventionist policy establishment in the United States is not dead. And I think there are still many connections and uh, many points of commonality between the United States and Europe that should be understood in the context of that fact, right? So there is a standard view of international relations that was shared between these neoliberal slash neoconservative elite in the United States and the European elites, and I think that's the inertia that is still driving the European policy attitudes and behavior.
Yeah. Um, Professor Grigoryan, you earlier mentioned the prospect of the use of nuclear weapons. And just to remind our listeners, we're recording this on Saturday, June 21st, after the United States already attacked those nuclear research sites. Iran has 4 sites, the Bushehr, which is the only one that's spared, which is an active nuclear power plant, and if that one is hit, it would create a like Chernobyl-like catastrophe. But these ones are apparently, they don't contain enough radiation in the nuclear material in them to cause widespread contamination. And there were reports that Iranians emptied it anyway before the attacks. But previously, various analysts were saying that the only way that the U.S. could completely nullify Iran's nuclear capacity was to essentially use nuclear weapons um, as regrettable as it is to think even about it. But what happened after today was that Trump said, well, all the nuclear sites are gone, kaput, and declared victory. Does this mean that the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is less now? Or if this thing escalates, there is still the threat of use of nuclear weapons. And if that happens, how likely is still the threat of a nuclear attack by either the US or Israel? And what does it portend for nuclear non-proliferation?
Yeah, nuclear non-proliferation would be dead as a concept, or even the treaty uh, would come under serious pressure, as many other countries might also get the idea, or decide that their best bet is to go nuclear. And this is, I'm not the first one to point this out, and this is a common conversation among many analysts and scholars of international relations. The comparison between what happened to Libya and how the West and the United States dealt with North Korea, right, has not escaped anybody.
Mm-hmm.
It's too obvious to see how differently countries that already have nuclear weapons are treated compared to those that do not, or agree to give, or have hostile relations with the United States or with the West, and agree to give up such ambitions. So I think Iran is certainly going to tear up the. I mean, it's going to move out of the NPT after this, especially if nuclear weapons are used. Although, if nuclear weapons are used, we don't even know what the world will look like after that, and whether anybody will care about things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But certainly, I mean, the treaty would become an anachronism in that case. And as far as the tactical situation, what this attack may or may not have achieved, and what may follow this attack, I have read similar reports that Iranians had emptied the Fordo plant, the enrichment plant, and that even if the attack succeeded in destroying the facilities there, which is a total assumption, by the way. I think that destroying that facility is very, very difficult, and we don't know. I mean, at least I haven't seen any damage assessment reports, and we don't know if the attack has succeeded. In fact, even though Trump made some boastful statement about that. But even if it has succeeded, many people have mentioned that Iranians, in all likelihood, have removed all the material from there, and the attack may have been pointless, essentially. And it may not have had quite the effect that they wanted with regard to Iran's capacity to continue with uranium enrichment. And again, we're returning to the same question: under what circumstances this may become the use of nuclear weapons may become a possibility. I mean, if Israel's back is on the wall, if Iran survives this, and if Iran continues to pound Israel, and if Israeli air defenses are completely obliterated and completely exhausted, then Israel's escalation options are become quite limited. And if the United States joins the war and engages in an increased and more intense campaign of aerial bombardment, that still might not be sufficient for thwarting Iranian retaliation or Iranian attacks using ballistic missiles against Israel and in fact against some American targets, although I think Iranians probably are going to keep focusing on striking Israel. In that case, I think if not the United States, Israel might start contemplating the use of a nuclear device. And we know from history, I mean, not only from history, but from nuclear deterrence theory, that nuclear weapons can be used if a country is in a situation where it considers its existence, its very existence threatened. And I think there is that mindset in Israel. And it will be intensified if the Iranian strikes become more and more effective, right? Under such circumstances, and if they don't fear retaliation, similar retaliation, the use of nuclear weapons becomes, well, it becomes rational, essentially. It becomes
An option.
it becomes an option.
Mm.
The United States, after all, used atomic weapons against Japan. Japan couldn't retaliate. Now, having said that, I think throughout the last, what is it, 8 decades now of possessing these weapons, there have been some cases where nuclear armed states have accepted defeat rather than escalate to nuclear use. The United States withdrew from Vietnam. The Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, right? So, and then they calculated that the costs of such defeat, the cost of accepting defeat in those cases, were lower than the cost of victory with nuclear weapons, right? Because that would have reverberations and international political consequences that were not worth the victory that the United States or the Soviet Union could have had in Vietnam or in Afghanistan. But this is quite different. This is a situation where Israel may think that its back is on the wall, and it may contemplate the use of a nuclear weapon, thinking that Iran does not have a retaliatory option. Now, in recent days, so there have been some conversations about, in effect, Iran having a retaliatory option, and the retaliatory option is striking the Dimona reactor in Israel, right?
Right.
So they don't, if they could possibly hit the Dimona reactor, and I imagine that it's a very well protected site and it would not be easy to penetrate and it would not be easy to strike that, but that's something that Israelis may worry about in case of when they're contemplating the use of a nuclear device. So in such a dramatic and extreme scenario, I think that is something that may have a deterrent effect if Iranians could credibly threaten taking out the Dimona reactor or hitting the Dimona reactor, and that would have a Chernobyl effect.
Yeah.
If they were to succeed, and we know Israel is small, and such a catastrophe would have absolutely. I mean, such a successful strike would have absolutely catastrophic effects for Israel.
Dr. Grigoryan, do the Arab countries have any agency in this conflict?
Well, the Arab countries have been, in effect, I mean, I'm talking about Syria and Jordan. I mean, they have made their airspace available to Israel and the United States, even in prior cases where Iran retaliated against Israel following the attack on the Iranian embassy in Syria. You remember how Jordanians participated in the campaign of intercepting
Some
Iranian
of the drones.
Israeli missiles, etc., etc. So I think the Jolani government in Syria and the Jordanian government are quite closely allied with the United States and Israel, and they're not going to suddenly change their allegiance and somehow support Iran. I mean, we know also that in the case of Syria, at least, the Jolani government has replaced the Assad government, which was friendly to Iran, and the Jolani government is considered one that is hostile to Iran.
What about the Saudi Arabias, the
Yeah,
Egypts, the Gulf states?
Egypt, I mean, we haven't seen any serious noise from Egypt. I don't think Egyptians seem to be poised to become active or to become a part of this fray. They're essentially holding a neutral line, and even on the Palestinian issue, Egypt's policy has been, well, for the lack of a better word, quite moderate. The Saudis also have been very low key. I mean, they have frozen the process of this Abraham Accord process,
Hmm.
which, by the way, I think torpedoing that process was one of the main motives for the attack of October the 7th. But be it as it may, I think the Saudi government, even though they have frozen that process and on occasion have criticized the behavior of Israel and other Gulf states as well, but they are closely tied and allied with the United States. And in addition to that, they have their own independent conflicts with Iran. Now, this is not to say that they would be happy with the total destruction of Iran or the use of a nuclear weapon against Iran, or its dismemberment. But they are they're not in a position, or that there are no indications that Saudis are going to take a strong stance against the United States or Israel on the side of Iran. So they have a wait and see approach. I think one thing that Saudis and the other Arab Gulf states may be worried about is the other retaliatory option for Iran, which is the destruction of the oil infrastructure in the Gulf, hitting the oil facilities, including in Saudi Arabia, with the purpose of threatening the health of Western economies. So that's one other retaliatory option, and this is something that Saudis may be worried about. Now, the thing that Iranians that will have a deterrent effect on Iran itself is because Iran itself depends on its oil wealth and its oil infrastructure, and that will probably lead to retaliatory strikes against the Iranian infrastructure. And I'm not sure Iran will go that path, but in desperation, perhaps. And this is something that Saudis probably will worry about.
I'm going to pivot us towards Armenia as our last couple of sections. In many of your interviews in the past, even here on Groong, you've said that one of the worst things that could happen for Armenia is for a U.S.-Israel war against Iran. Well, here we are. Can you outline some of the dangers for Armenia in this potential, actually, initially, a potential Iranian defeat?
Mhm. Okay. So it's pretty straightforward and obvious why that would be such a war, and the potential Iranian defeat would be a catastrophe for Armenia. Armenia has four neighbors: Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Iran. With one of its neighbors, it's still in a state of war. They haven't signed a peace treaty yet. That's Azerbaijan, and there was a recent war. There are very hostile relations with Azerbaijan. Turkey is firmly in Azerbaijan's corner, although there are some recent signs of thaw in Armenian-Turkish relations. Your viewers probably know that the Prime Minister of Armenia was in Turkey yesterday. And but nonetheless, the border is closed. There are no
Hmm.
diplomatic relations. Turkey is firmly in Azerbaijan's corner, and Turkey's policy toward Armenia is essentially derivative from Armenian-Azerbaijani relations. Georgia has been a friendly country. I don't think there are any serious complaints about Georgia. But Iran is another friendly country and a very important one for Armenia. And in fact, on some issues, uh, Iran has been adamant in terms of siding with Armenia and sharing Armenian preferences. I'm talking, of course, about the Sunni corridor, which Azerbaijan has been demanding since the war of 2020, and they have been. I mean, they're not clearly saying that, but essentially what they hope to acquire is some kind of an extraterritorial corridor, a corridor that would connect Azerbaijan to Nakhichevan and Turkey, where Armenia's sovereignty would be curtailed in some way, right? And that creates all sorts of fears and dangers about Armenia losing its border with Iran. And Iran has been quite concerned about that as well. And on several occasions, Iran has been the one country that has articulated its opposition to any such ambitions from Azerbaijan, especially, opening that corridor by force, arguing that it is a red line for Iran. So if you look at that kind of a relationship, and also the fact that out of four neighbors, two of Armenia's neighbors are quite hostile, and we have close borders with them, and very complicated relations with them. The friendly Iran is a very important country is very important for Armenia.
Well, let's flip the table then. What scenarios come to life if Iran is victorious in this war?
Well, before we talk about Iranian victory, I think there is also one other danger that we should think about in case of an Iranian defeat. And one of the most catastrophic scenarios of Iranian defeat, and this is actually quite interesting because the when we think about the difficulties that any country has in achieving victory without ground operation, without a ground force, here we have to think about the possibility of destabilizing Iran from within and exploiting its diversity. And one of the dangers that Armenians are especially sensitive to is the possibility of fragmentation of Iran and the emergence of either another Azerbaijani entity in the north of Iran, where Azerbaijanis have the ethnic Azerbaijanis have a majority, or some sort of a scenario where that area comes under Azerbaijan's control. So Armenia would be surrounded from three sides, from the west, the east, and the south by Azerbaijan and Turkey, and it would completely lose its border and its connection to Iran, which would be a strategic catastrophe for Armenia, quite obviously. And this is something that is probably not very likely to happen, but ruling it out entirely is also not possible. So these are the things that are quite worrisome for Armenia. And also there are other issues. I mean, if they use nuclear weapons, or if they hit nuclear sites where there is contamination, that Armenia is relatively close, and whether that will have consequences for Armenia, we don't know. Finally, not only Armenia, but all the countries in the region have to worry about total destabilization and refugee flows and that sort of thing. And there has already been an increased flow of people from Iran to Armenia in the last week. So that's something else that Armenia uh, might have to worry about. As
Mhm.
far as Iran's victory is concerned, if Iran withstands this pressure and ends up victorious in this conflict, that it's the flip side of all these arguments, right? So the chances of Iran's fragmentation will be lowered, and Iran will become much more assertive in some ways, including on the issue of not allowing any threats to the Armenian Iranian border to materialize. And it's being a friendly country to Armenia, its survival and its victory would be in Armenia's interest, especially since Russia is very preoccupied, and sometimes Russia has not been able to assert its presence in the South Caucasus in ways that Armenians would have liked. All right, and we know I don't want to
Yeah.
take us down this path, but there have been conversations over the last few years since the escalation of the war in Ukraine that Russians have not lived up to their obligations to Armenia, and
Hmm.
Russians have not been sufficiently engaged in certain cases and in certain issue areas where Armenia expected or anticipated Russian protection or Russian help. So, under such circumstances, as long as Russia is preoccupied, I think having a strong Iranian partner would be in Armenia's interest.
Uh, we know that Erdogan publicly condemns Israel, and but at the same time, it should be mentioned that Turkish territory continues to be used to supply Israeli oil to supply Azerbaijani oil to Israel through the BTC pipeline, and that shows no signs of stopping. And 6 months ago, we know that Turkey and Israel, whether explicitly or implicitly, they cooperated in the seizure of Syria, and Syria is a de facto Turkish state. We've talked about it as well. It at least most of the leadership of Syria now has roots and training in Turkey.
Mhm.
In addition to this, Turkish media is openly discussing this idea of separatist movements inside Iran, partitioning or dismembering Iran. I would say salivating, but that may not be a good enough word to express it anyway.
Mhm.
And of course, the Israelis really are wanting this. Jerusalem Post on June 18th featured an article that said that Iran needs to be dismantled into either a federal state or just partitioned outright. And Israel should guarantee security to all the states that break off and participate in this adventure. What is the interest of Turkey here? Is Turkey truly opposing Israel, or are Ankara and Tel Aviv aligned, just like in Syria, in this attack against Iran?
There are mutually competing motives that drive Turkey's policy in this case, specifically or toward Israel more generally. I mean, traditionally, Israel and Turkey have been very good allies and very good partners, and Turkey has been a part of the traditional Israeli diplomacy, the diplomatic doctrine of having friendly Muslim states on the periphery of the Arab world. And Azerbaijan is also a recent addition to that list as part of that doctrine. On numerous other issues, Israel and Turkey have participated. They have been both part of the Western camp, right? At least until the emergence of Erdogan and his party as leaders of Turkey. So they are natural allies in many respects, and they have cooperated traditionally, and they have seen eye to eye on many issues. At the same time, there are problems in their relationship, in their relations. There have been conflicts that have affected the Turkish-Israeli relationship. Most importantly, I think the flirting of Israel with the idea of a Kurdish state in the Middle East, not necessarily on Turkish territory, but let's say, creation of a full-blown Kurdish state in northern Iraq, that has been, the Turks have considered the creation of any Kurdish state anywhere in the neighborhood a major, if not an existential threat against Turkey, fearing that it might fuel Kurdish separatism in Turkey, or it would naturally become a hostile state to Turkey, etc., etc. And I think this has been the most important sticking point in the relations between Israel and Turkey. And the other major issue, I think, that has had the effect of deteriorating the relations between Turkey and Israel, is that with this new elite having taken over Turkey, I mean, they're not, when they call Erdogan and his party Islamists, I mean, in some ways, yes, they're not the most radical Islamists, but certainly Erdogan has had the ambition of assuming some kind of a leadership role in the Islamic world.
Caliph, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's entirely too serious, but there have been such ambitions, and especially since the Europeans pretty much closed the door to European Union membership for Turkey. And since that policy of the Kemalist elite, the secularist elite in Turkey, has essentially been a failure, right? I think the current elite in Turkey is more open about its relationship with the Islamic world, and more aggressive about engagement with the East and with the Islamic world, and assuming a leadership position. And as such, it could not ignore what was happening in Palestine. And as part of such ambitions in the Islamic world, it had to assume a critical stance toward Israel with regard to its treatment of Palestinians, which also has negatively affected the relationship between Israel and Turkey. But with regard to Iran, even though on many occasions Erdogan has been quite critical of this aggressive policy toward Iran from the United States, um, we do know that it's they have a mixed feelings about this, right? To
Yeah.
say the least. And certainly historically, and even in contemporary contexts, I think many in Turkey and the Turkish national security establishment consider Iran a rival state. And yeah, some of the more radical elements in Turkey, as well as in Azerbaijan, may have designs about partitioning Iran and creating another Azerbaijani entity there, or possibly annexing it to Azerbaijan. Such things, such aspirations may also drive at least some parts of the Turkish body politic. But there are also risks for such for such scenarios, if such scenarios were to materialize. So I think if you look at the bottom line is that if you look at the Turkish policy, they seem to be going back and forth on these issues, and it's not clear which motive becomes dominant. So sometimes different motives dominate their discourse and their attitudes,
Yeah.
depending on circumstances.
Would you say it's fair to say that if the opportunity presented itself, then they would definitely get involved and ensure um, that whatever states are created, they would be allied to Turkey, I guess,
Absolutely. I mean,
Right,
it would be difficult to imagine that they wouldn't do it.
right.
So even if they have misgivings about that, even if they have mixed feelings about that, if it came to that, certainly they would get involved and make sure that whatever status quo is created after a possible partition of Iran is a status quo that favors them, or whatever entities emerge as a result are friendly to Turkey. So
Yeah.
that is pretty. Um, it doesn't take too much training in international relations or in Turkish politics to make such a claim.
Yeah, it's almost common sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're almost out of time, so we should probably stop here. But I can't help but make a remark that while all of these dangers around Armenia are happening, the Prime Minister of Armenia is busy doing what? You might say, thinking about the refugee crisis that's going to loom soon, or potential security issues. No, he is busy thinking about the celibacy of Armenian priests. And that is the twilight zone that Armenians live today. But we'll leave that for our next weekend review with Osped to bitch about that issue. So for now, Professor Grigoryan, thank you very much for joining us. And we try to make jokes, but the times are certainly dire, and our hope is that people are safe, and this thing gets resolved with minimum amount of casualties and disruption to the region.
Thank you, Arman.
Thank you very much.
Well, okay, that's our show today. This episode was recorded on June 21, 2025. We've been talking with Dr. Arman Grigoryan. He's an associate professor of international relations at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. He has a doctorate in political science from Columbia University in New York and a master's in IR from the University of Chicago. His research has appeared in International Security, Security Studies, International Studies Quarterly, International Political Science Review, Nationalities Papers, Ethnopolitics, and International Analytics. For more information, you can go to our show notes page. That's at podcasts.groong.org/episode number, and check out the show notes. This is also where we put all the links and references that we find.
Folks, keep helping us out as well by subscribing to us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you don't have those apps, I would just suggest maybe to download, create an account, and subscribe to us anyway. That will really help us. We are growing on those platforms, but we're not where we want to be. So I would appreciate any help you can provide to help us expand our reach that way. And I'm Hovik Manucharyan.
And I'm Osped Bedrosian. Both of us are in Los Angeles.
Yes, although my background picture, if you noticed, is always Armenia. This is, by the way, this is the view from Sambata Berd in Armenia, in the Vyosur province that we always talk about. So there's a little Easter egg for you, and why I chose this specific picture.
I guess that's a little bit of a contrast between the two of us. You have one from Armenia, and I have one from the diaspora. That's from the Glendale Hills right here behind me, actually, just a little over this way from one of my hikes.
Yeah. Yeah, but in spirit, I'm always in Armenia, and in a few weeks, I will be back there. So thank you for listening to us, and please find us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. Of course, the links are, as always, in the show notes.
We'll talk to you soon.